Griffero studied some of the papers written by Gestalt therapists. So he tried to bridge a bit this and to find a common ground. And of course, I'm aware that we have to do something similar. We have to be open to something that is otherness. And it's not the right setting to understand a new philosophical systems or to catch new philosophical ideas. I think it will be, for people that are interested, it will be important to read something. Anyway, I hope that we can just make some point of interest. Interest, as I always say, is a word coming from Latin that is made by two words, inter and esse. That means to be in the between of being. So if we put some interest, we stay at the contact boundary. So thank you for your interest. Interest is a crucial ingredient of our meeting today. Just a frame in order to make a draft of a bridge. If you remember the opening ceremony, and if you remember your feelings at the moment, there were a kind of suspense, there were a kind of excitement, something was about to happen, and then many people came to me and said, "Oh, what a good atmosphere." They didn't say, "Oh." Yes, yesterday we had a panel on evil. But today was God, because when the light went away, the atmosphere immediately changed. And your bodies changed immediately. So we will talk about atmospheres and aesthetics. You can see I'm even more elegant than usual. So I'm not the chairman. I want just to introduce this frame. I introduce Tonino Griffero. I'm very happy you are here, Tonino. We met, I think, 3 years ago, thanks to a colleague from Germany, Olaf Zielke. Then we discovered that we were born in the same city, Torino. That is also the city that was quoted yesterday by Donna, where Primo Levi was born and committed suicide. So Tonino Griffero is a professor of aesthetics at the University of Rome. He's the director of the Master in Aesthetic Communication, and he has many publications that you can find if you are interested. You can find papers for free in the website. He is in the program. He recently published a book in English that the title is Atmospheres, Aesthetics of Emotional Spaces. And a new book is coming out in English. I think the title is Quasi-things. Quasi-things. Quasi is a strange word, means almost. Almost. Quasi-things. Almost things. What's happening there? I think that one of the important contribution of Griffero is to make available in other languages a philosophical system that is written only in German. So I guess that German people here are more familiar or can be familiar with it. The title of the presentation of Tonino is Atmospheres as Quasi-things for Pathic Aesthetics. This will be the speech. As yesterday, we will have the speech of 45 minutes, something like that. So breathe and be prepared for a philosophical speech of 45 minutes. And then we will have 3 comments. I would like that we introduce who we are before, so we have the clear picture of what it will happen.
Good morning. I would like to salute you, the Gestalt community present here, and my colleagues. My name is Mônica Alvim. I'm from Brazil, and I am a Gestalt therapist, a psychologist, trainer and supervisor in Gestalt therapy, and I work as a professor at Rio de Janeiro Federal University, and I'm very glad to be here.
Good morning, I'm Jean-Marie Robin. I'm from Bordeaux, France, and belong to the French Institute of Gestalt Therapy. And what else? Incidentally, I am among the co-founders of EAGT.
Thank you for mentioning that, because you were one of the former president of the EAGT in the 80s, I guess.
I don't remember.
You don't remember? Okay. Yes, quite a long time ago. So thank you, Tonino. We are ready, I hope, to listen to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for invitation, for your kind invitation. My paper is about outside feelings, atmospheres as quasi-things. So my paper has its frame of reference in the project of a pathic aesthetics. By pathic, I mean the affective involvement that the perceiver feels, often unable to critically react to or to mitigate the intrusiveness of. This very involvement is, for me, the core of the aesthetic sphere, in the etymological sense of aesthesis, much more so than art and beauty. Philosophically, rehabilitating pathicity means valorizing the nowadays so rare ability to let oneself go. One could sum it up as the ability to be a means of what happens to us rather than subjects of what we do. The skill was obviously misunderstood by the rationalistic post-Enlightenment dogma of subjective sovereignty and finalistic action. The practicability of this pathicity, though, entirely depends on our ability to welcome what happens to us, whether we like it or not, resisting the temptation both to transform the given into something done and to seek shelter from this contingency in late romantic nostalgias. Only if we philosophically valorize what happens can pathic aesthetics truly adopt Baumgarten's idea, old idea, that aesthetics is also a theory of sensible knowledge. Elsewhere, I have defined this theory as a thought of the senses, where the genitive is both subjective and objective, conceiving it as a non-gnostic, but indeed pathic phenomenology. For this very reason, aesthetics is finally free from what is only one of its many possible conceptions, that of philosophy or even metaphysics of art. In fact, classic aesthetics was idealistic in focusing on the work of art and its supposed autonomy, metaphysical in considering art and beauty sub specie aeternitatis, bourgeois in its full adherence to the process of civilization of the European elite. And finally, intellectual in focusing on judgment or interpretation rather than experience, and in misunderstanding the role of felt bodily sensitivity in the name of the Kantian alibi of disinterested pleasure. In short, classic aesthetics was and is governed by the same estrangement from and of nature that we find in the hard sciences and in the Enlightenment apology of the alleged autonomy of the subject. However, as soon as one abandons these aesthetics from above and traces artworks back to exemplary cases of sensible perception, one sees that it is possible to avoid the frustrations caused both by transcendentalism, which only thinks about the conditions of possibility of something, and by interpretationism, hermeneutics, and semiotics, which is always content with a deferred sense at the expense of the presence. Pathic aesthetics, instead, intends to remain as faithful as possible to the presence, to the way in which appearances resound in our lived body. Therefore, I am interested in our ordinary sensible experiences, especially when they are involuntary. What changes here is the very meaning of experience. A pathic aesthetics, in fact, does not presuppose an interpretative and constructive approach. That is, the idea that the world is given only through some reflective assess, but rather supposes that there is a sense in both meanings of the word that is always already sedimented outside of us and can be verified through our felt bodily and pre-reflexive communication with the world. The expressive qualities that radiating atmospheres become quasi-things are both particular natural phenomena, twilight, luminosity, darkness, the seasons, the wind, the weather, the hours of the day, the fog, etc., and relatively artificial phenomena, townscape, music, soundscape, the numinous, dwelling, charisma, the gaze, the shame, the psychopathological field, etc. They imply qualities that are salient not despite being apparent and ephemeral, but precisely because of that. Exactly as in Gestalt therapy, where subjective experience is an emergent, I quote Francesetti, is an emergent phenomenon of the actualized field, so that the therapist is no longer seen to work on the client, but rather seeks to modulate the field co-created together with the client through his own experience. End of quotation. Western thought, and sometimes common sense, considers these ephemeral qualities, since they come and go, and we cannot wonder where they have been, devoid of reality, as opposed to full things, which are endowed with borders, separated from others, perduring in time, and are normally inactive if not touched. The present pathic and atmospherological aesthetics, which is broadly realist in rejecting the lazy explanatory hypothesis of associationist and projectivist type, emphasizes instead the cooperative relationship between perception and the more nuanced dimension of quasi-things, which, just like the ecstasy of things, emotionally tune our surroundings. The core of this in-between, however, is always the felt or lived body, Leib in German. That is the non-physiological or anatomic dimension of our body. I also seek to rehabilitate here the specifically aesthetological and life-worldly paradigm of a certainty thought of as experientia vaga, without rules, irreducible to an etiologic and genetic approach. However vague, because it underscores our effective heterodetermination, this experiential and sensible certainty attests our being in the world better than other traditionally privileged states, including the cogito, and offers maybe the possibility to better understand another person, including others' suffering. In short, we must learn to experience pathically, in the right way, no longer regarding teleological efficiency as a privileged path. We must pay attention not to our role as subjects, but to the pathic to me, or the perceptological me, that precedes egological solidification, which as such is fatally destined to the dualism typical of cognitivism. I said that it is the atmospherological paradigm that guides the analysis of quasi-things. But what is an atmosphere? First of all, it is an example of the passive synthesis, largely intersubjective and holistic, that precedes analysis and influences from the outset the emotional situation of the perceiver, resisting any conscious attempt at projective adaptation. As an influential presence, an atmosphere is, in short, more a special state of the world than a very private psychic state. This, however, presupposes the overturning of an introjectionist metaphysics largely dominant in our culture, and the new phenomenology of the body. In fact, as pervasive impressions that precede the subject-object distinction, the authority of atmospheres precisely resonates in our felt body. But similarly to quasi-things, atmospheres too cannot but irritate traditional ontology because of their unavoidable vagueness. Then it might be convenient to begin by precisely defining what kind of perception the atmospheric and quasi-thingly one is. What to say, for example, that there is something in the air means, or try to explain what kind of philosophical and not only literary reflection Dickens has in his mind when writes, for example, in Hard Times, "Are you in pain, dear mother? I think there is a pain somewhere in the room," said Mrs. Gradgrind. "But I couldn't positively say that I have got it." First of all, perception here means having an experience and not the distancing, constative process that specialized experimental psychology limits itself to. And least of all, it means having the mere passive, reflective registration of a portion of the visual field by an immobile eye. This perception, then, does not concern cohesive, solid, continuous objects that are mobile only through contact, nor discrete forms and movements, but rather chaotic multiple situations, and quasi-things endowed with their significance, whose petulant focalization would even represent a pathology. In other words, in this kind of perception, the phenomenological that and how reveal themselves to be irreducible to the cognitive what. Perceiving atmospherically is not grasping presumed elementary sense data, and only afterwards, per accidents, qualitative emotional states of things, but it is instead being involved by outside feelings. Perceiving atmospheres mostly means being touched by them in the felt body. Unlike the physical body, a legitimate object of natural sciences, the felt body is indeed devoid of surfaces and occupies an absolute and not geometrical space. It is capable of self-auscultation without organic mediations. It is manifest in the affective sphere and articulated, according to Hermann Schmitz, not into discrete parts, but into felt bodily aisles that communicate with each other and with the world. It is indeed this felt bodily communication with all the perceived that explains the perception of quasi-things. things. The felt body feels what belongs to us also in the surrounding area, without drawing on the five senses and the perceptual body schema. This is how we have an acquaintanceship with ourselves, a lived and not only intellectual self-consciousness. Although atmospheres are opaque to the so-called expert knowledge, they produce a real segmentation of life-worldly reality. In fact, while uniting and allowing for a productive tuning, they also divide at the same time. As invariance thus obtained from a flux, they must certainly be registered in the ontological repertoire originated by our ordinary and intuitive segmentation of reality. Most of all, atmospheres take us out of our inner closed-off sphere. It would be a matter of taking everything out, even ourselves, and thus freeing ourselves from interior life, bringing, as Sartre says, terror and magic back into things. This neo-phenomenological approach claims the right to express, indeed, how one feels, namely, to examine experience so as to discern its atmospheric charge in the light of anesthesiologic and quasi-thingly sensibility. This approach must also rehabilitate the so-called first impression. That is to say, the involuntary life experiences that function as a global response and show our effective felt bodily involvement. When, for example, we feel something when visiting a certain apartment for the first time, we have an affective and felt bodily perception that has immediate evaluational and expressive consequences, whose rational explanation, though, sounds only like a flat rationalization ex post. In this case, we perceive atmospheres or quasi-things that are indeed feelings, but mostly external ones, effused into a special dimension and constrained by situations that can be distinguished from others precisely thanks to their peculiar atmospheric tone. The desubjectification of atmospheres attempted here must not lead us to forget that a quasi-thingly effect is still relative to a subject who feels touched by something partially undecipherable. But if the variable intensity of the atmospheric impression therefore depends also on the subject, its phenomenic apparition must be framed in the sphere of Husserl's passive synthesis and James Gibson's affordance. What I mean to say with this ecological account of atmospheric agency is that people are not surrounded by things that are devoid of meaning, but by things and quasi-things always already effectively connoted. As James Gibson says, the perceiving of an affordance is a process of perceiving a value-rich ecological object. In the human life world, there is indeed nothing rare than the perception of an inexpressive object. And it is perhaps atmosphericness itself that makes it possible for mere sensation to become a real perception. However, going here beyond Gibson, I must say that forms, whether they are static or in motion, do not express merely apparent causal relation and pragmatic affordances, but also tertiary qualities or sentimental and therefore atmospheric ones, which permeate the space in which they are perceived. They are, in other words, shivers of meaning, present in things or quasi-things, within certain limits, no less interobservable and repeatable than perspective properties. In this sense, for example, a diminished 7-chord suggests a tense and chilling atmosphere just because it sounds like a metallic friction, namely because of its own immanent sound material, and not for associationist reasons. It is only in this also atmospheric sense that, following Wertheimer, black is lugubrious even before being black. The idea, very briefly, is that atmospheres function as intermodal, amodal affordances. That is, as ecological invitations or meanings that are ontologically rooted in things and quasi-things, namely as affective invitations. Precisely due to their supervenience on material situations, atmospheres as quasi-things seems to demand spatial objectivity. For instance, it is legitimate to expect that the unease and the feeling of being spied on, aroused in us by a dark wood, is effectively and bodily felt by anyone who shares such an experience. The disquietude can certainly be greater for a city person than, say, for a lumberjack. But certainly the wood has for everyone traits that impede a projection of joy or light-heartedness. In opposition to the associationist temptation, or even worse, the conventionalist one must then restate that the atmospheric affordance of disquietude aroused by this wood does not derive from the thought of fear, but is rather the immediate irradiation of a quasi-thingly feeling that is specially poured out. Association, if anything, comes after, and it is certainly not arbitrary. However, I do not embrace in toto Hermann Schmidt's campaign of desubjectification of feelings. With the purpose of a wider practical applicability of this approach, I prefer to admit that there are various types of atmospheres, also depending on the characters of the quasi-things that radiate them. In short, they can be prototypic, objective, external, and unintentional, and sometimes lacking a precise name, derivative, objective, external, but intentionally produced, and even quite spurious in their relatedness, subjective and projective. These different types of atmospheres can then generate various types of emotional games. Let's see some examples. The first one is that an atmosphere can overwhelm us in aggressive moment and be refractory to a more or less conscious attempt at a projective reinterpretation, be it the harmlessly oppressive atmosphere of the lift, for example, when the hands are kept at the sides or used to steady the body by grasping a railing, the eyes are fixed on infinity and are not brought to bear on anyone for more than a passing glance. Or the sacral atmosphere, so engaging that it captures even those who walked into the church only to steal. Be it the atmosphere of joy that in a pub or at a party may infect the newcomers who may even have been depressed beforehand, so that they are swept up into the prevailing gaiety. The second example is that an atmosphere can also find us in tune with its syntonic moment, to the point that we don't realize we entered it, whereas others may even remain upset. The impressive entrance hall of a major banking institution, for example, will express an atmosphere of power for those who venture there in search of a loan, whence perhaps the impulse to leave the center of the room to take refuge in protective nooks and crannies, while expressing, on the contrary, an atmosphere of proud belonging, not clearly felt, for an employee who has developed a strong esprit de corps. And yet, note this point, what generates both atmospheres, awe and pride, is still the same special sentimental quality of intimidating vastness. An atmosphere, here's my third example, can then be recognized, be it felt as antagonistic or not, without being really felt in our body, or can be experienced in a contrary way. The first case is Faust, who perceives the atmosphere, I quote Goethe, an atmosphere of order, peace, and contentment in Gretchen's small, neat room, without sharing it. Faust doesn't share this feeling. Feels but doesn't share it. That is to say, one can recognize the objective roots of an atmosphere without feeling it. And indeed, this very resistance may be even conditioned by the inability to let oneself go, or even by a pathological protest, can in turn create a qualitatively different and even antithetical atmosphere. One could grasp the painful atmosphere of others, but through a dystonic form like joy. In fact, we all know from experience that our melancholy can be dispersed by the serenity of the environment, but it can also be resharpened by contrast. It happens also then when an atmosphere of joy is so dull and conventional that rather than making us rejoice, it ends up making us even sad. An atmosphere can sometimes elicit a resistance that pushes us to change it, but the intensity of the protest of our mood, in the case of an antagonistic encounter, is indeed the best, for me, the best proof of the objective effectiveness of the atmosphere we react to. Even more common is the fact that an atmosphere may not reach the necessary threshold for sensorial affective observation, thus causing an embarrassing atmospheric inadequacy for oneself and for others, such as when one euphorically joins a community where a tragic atmosphere hovers, or when in general one unexplainably feels out of place, perhaps even just because one is extraneous to the specific cultural declination of this or that atmosphere. Furthermore, we cannot overlook the fact that an atmosphere may, for various reasons, be perceived differently in the course of time, as when an apartment, which is barely adequate, becomes uninhabitable to some people at the exact moment that a rising apartment house next door cuts off the view. An atmospheric effect may change, for example, because of an even slight change in the perceptual space, or because of a change in the climatic conditions, such as when the atmosphere of sadness suggested by a shaded space brightens up when the cloud disappears, or when the atmosphere of a fully illuminated landscape turns into a different one when it appears to us in the backlight, but also due to an additional cognition, such as when the growing doubts of the subordinates gradually turn the charismatic atmosphere irradiated by their leader into an atmosphere of inadequacy, if not even worthlessness. Or when the discovery of the fictional or even manipulative character of the proposed atmosphere reflexively cancels its effect, at least in part. Or perhaps because of a perception of the atmospheric situation outside of the sensory illusion it normally feeds on. The atmospheric effect of the mountains, for example, cannot but change if we ascertain, by means of photography, that they are less and less steep than it appears or than we might imagine, or that in any perceptual framework, the left is always optically privileged. But the atmospheric effect may also change because of a purely personal experience, such as when the atmosphere of the hospital ceases to be anxious because after despairing for long, we finally find a doctor. Or because working there, we feel like it's a sort of second family to us. Or it could be sufficient to experience a variation of the perceptive distance, as when the atmosphere of magnificence of a building resolves at a close distance in an atmosphere of decay. Or even more simply, a change in the physiological condition. In fact, I quote Heidegger, when our stomachs are out of sorts, they can cast a pall over all things. What would otherwise seem indifferent to us suddenly becomes irritating and disturbing. End of quotation. And lastly, an atmosphere may be so dependent on the perceptual form that for some people it concretizes itself even in materials, in a broad sense of the word, that normally express different moods. This is why a drink seems to taste better in a dark and dimly lit bar. It's a fact that the choice of materials always exceeds the functionalist engineering dogma, namely that such choice aims at the quality of appearance, from which it is hoped that the desired atmosphere can pour out. Without even the disappointment of perception being completely non-atmospheric, it simply involves the transition from an atmosphere to another one, perhaps even axiologically opposite. And in extreme case, some situations can even suggest atmospheric feelings that normally they don't suggest, as in the case, to mention but a few well-known examples, of Proust's Madeleine moment. Eliot's poetic but wholly idiosyncratic April is the cruelest month. Or Choran's belief that self-disdain could be strengthened by the beauty of a landscape. Summing up, an atmosphere is the object of natural perception, but it is filtered through the ideas and evaluations of the perceiver. And this, indeed, an invitation that can also be changed or partly declined. But by stating this, I do not mean to fully embrace a projective relativism. And the reason is always the same. If by observing an atmosphere, we ipso facto alter it, no first atmosphere could ever overwhelm us and affect us. However, atmospheres are both an example, or rather the main example, of the wider ontological category of quasi-things, and the fundamental way in which quasi-things touch and involve us. We could also talk here of affective enactivism, in the sense that whether we surrender to a situation as such full of atmospheric energy, or fulfill the affective action through which we consolidate incipient or only vague emotions, without the external condition and constraints we call atmospheres, we wouldn't experience certain feelings, or at least not feel them as something precise and or authoritative. Despite the fact that they don't exist fully, that is, in the only sense contemplated by reductionism, the half entities I thematize act very powerfully on us. And this happens not despite, but precisely thanks to their attenuated physical reality. In fact, why is it that, say, the future or an image, despite being less present than the couch we are set on, are able to condition our thoughts and choices much more than the couch? Why is it that a melody, thanks to its very efficacious half-reality, can become an earworm that keeps coming back to our mind, even unpleasantly? The reason is that images and melodies, for example, are instances of quasi-things that generate a deep, intimate, felt bodily resonance through their expressive qualities. However, to understand this new ontological category, one must let go of the rigid millenary dualism that admits the existence of only things, substance, and sensible qualities, accident. In order to do so, one must take the liberty to prescind from pragmatic purposes and the indisputable, but only representational, advantage offered by the artificial objectification of what is elusive. Only in this liberated condition can we finally experience something that is not a substance and yet is not an accident either. We must not hide here the fact that also the psychopathological field could be a quasi-things that people perceive as an atmosphere which surround and influence them. Therefore, the name quasi-things can be attributed to the sensible qualities that, for their marked expressiveness and intrusiveness, have a real physiognomic character. They affect us like partners, and this also explains their millenary mythical poetic hypostatization. In this sense, we can say that a quasi-thing is any entity that, while not being a full thing, exerts on us a more direct and immediate suggestive power than that exerted by the full thing. Even the faint dropping of a tap in another room, usually unnoticed, can under certain conditions turn into loud noise, which haunts us just as a confused noise turns into a non-existent voice persecuting the psychotic subject. It should now be clear that the philosophy I embrace is not paralyzed by physicalism and reductionism. Rather, it explicitly favors ontological inflationism. That's the authentic leitmotif of my works. And the phenomenology engaged with what appears, the phenomenon, as it appears. As it appears. And in the affective bodily involvement it implies, besides its genesis or causes. But the present context provides only insight into authority of atmosphere. Of course, this authority does depend, like that of speech acts, on a certain necessary contextual requirements. Being, for example, in a church as tourists, waiting for the bus to take us elsewhere, is very different from being there as believers waiting for a true encounter with God. But in other cases, an atmosphere is violently imposed over the perceiver without any precondition, completely reorienting his emotional situation and proving wholly refractory to any relatively conscious attempt at a projective adaptation. In this sense, an atmosphere that I feel externally is mine, not because I possess it, possessive sense of the pronoun, but because it concerns me, subjectivizing sense of the pronoun. The authority of atmospheric feelings can be traced back to a sort of prestige or force that constrains and enthralls even in the absence of physical coercion. It may take various forms, and in most radical case is able to inhibit any critical distance in those who come across it. The angst-inducing atmosphere produced, for example, by the ubiquity of the so-called breaking news predisposes those who are enmeshed by it to see enemies everywhere, or at least to overestimate the dangers of the outside world. My aim is not to relegate the issue of power and the authority legitimating it to sociology, or even worse, to the physical sciences. We should ask then ourselves if the private and collective emotional life is not more easily explained by the anti-introjectionistic hypothesis that feelings are not internal properties of the psychological subject, but relatively stable and authoritarian entities around which the subject has to revolve. So, if not any atmosphere, for sure the prototypical one implicitly claims an absolute validity, and thus inhibits, at least in principle, any real critical reaction in the perceiver. The most common temptation is certainly that of explaining the externality and authority of atmospheres by referring to culturally determined emotional norms. Well, the socially desirable trend to adjust our own feelings to the one we encounter explains here much, but not certainly everything. Then the binding authority of an atmosphere, such as a meadow, that we might call not at all metaphorically happy, does not come from a subjectivistic fictional inference. It is as if the meadow were happy, but rather from the effect of resonance of the percept, that meadow in the perceiver, who feels this atmospheric authority in his life, in his felt body, even if as not originating from it. This authority may take many forms. We can here think of the pedagogical one, which is necessarily based in all its choices, communicative forms, spaces, rituals, etc., on pathic affordances addressed to the learner's felt body. But equally noteworthy is the case of the vicarious shame, whose atmosphere, without being felt by the shameless person, even conditioned the detached observer and his physiognomic gestural conduct. Not to mention the depressive field, in which, as a result of the reactivation of sensibility at the boundary, therapist and client are depressing together right now. A very simple and intentionally naive example, very dear to Hermann Schmitz, is that of the cheerful person who, encountering a sad person, tends not to encourage her to recover her lost dignity, as if this person were merely tired. But he tends to mitigate or completely conceal his own joy in order to respect the privacy of the other. This is because the atmospheric sadness claims entirely and exclusively for itself the space of lived presence and represses, to various degrees, the atmosphere of joy. That is why the sad person normally feels more legitimate than the cheerful person to sink into his atmosphere. And he does not only feel an intense atmospheric contrast when he comes across a joyful atmosphere, whence the worsening of his sadness, but he also feels entitled to more or less explicitly protest against what he regards as the unjustified happiness of others. Thus, generalizing this type of confrontational game, we could say that the atmospheric feelings, inherently endowed with greater authority, inevitably prevail. It may be the vanity of things perceived in a cold winter morning or in an anonymous known place, the solemn gravity, the holy, that impresses one who enters a church, or the law that impresses the defendant, convinced of being smarter than the court called upon to judge him. It may be the wrath that persecutes, sometimes to the point of paranoia, the one who feels a strong sense of guilt for his actions, but also the mutual trust felt by those who breathe it as being irreducible to the logic of giving and trying to get something back. It may also be the good gestalt forming at the contact boundary. It may be, finally, the binding authority of the atmosphere of love. It is no coincidence that it justifies at least part of the crazy things one does for love. And it also arouses, even in those who not reciprocate such feeling, a certain respect for those who are caught by it. That brings us to end. As already mentioned, the authority of prototypical atmospheres exists in the proper sense only when it overcomes all the critical scruples that the perceiver may mobilize. That is, when reflection does not weaken the suggestion of an atmosphere as a quasi-thing. This is an atmospheric binding sense that can be hardly overestimated in the shocking and so productive philosophical re-evaluation of suffering as a pathic way of life. This philosophy teaches us to understand and appreciate in our daily lives the meaning of the Lutheran statement, famous political, religious statement. Sometimes, and when we least expect it, we could find ourselves in the condition of saying, exactly like Luther, but now for quite different reasons, emotional, atmospheric reasons, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. Here I stand, I cannot feel otherwise. Thank you.
For me, it's fascinating to see how much the evolution of your branch of phenomenology can have some parallel lines with the evolution of Gestalt therapy, with about some of our core concepts. I feel particularly involved in evoking some common concepts. But there are also some parts of your lectures that I didn't understand due to many holes in my philosophical background. Fortunately, I had so many opportunities in my career to work about my shame that I can simply accept these holes. About pathic experience, yes, the concept of pathic did not colonize yet Gestalt therapy world. The French-speaking community maybe could be more familiar with this concept because a very influential philosopher in France, Henri Maldinet, used a lot this concept to build his phenomenological psychiatry and his approach to art, particularly painting and poetry, through this concept. However, I consider that its implications are implicitly well known and used in the Gestalt therapy clinical practice through our insistence on starting from what is felt, what emerges within the actual and present situation and in the body. Could we see also here some closeness with this famous and disparaged invite by Peirce in the 60s, lose your mind and come to your senses? However, as a Gestalt therapist, I would not valorize that much some of your words I have heard or read from you, the ability to be a means of what happens to us rather than subject of what we do. A great emphasis in Gestalt therapy is put on what we call the middle voice. And according to the Paul Goodman's words, it's the unity prior and posterior to activity and passivity, containing both. And what we define as self in Gestalt therapy is a synthesis of the active I and the passive me, which can emerge thanks to the contacting situation. About aesthetics, I feel deeply concerned since one of my first articles in the early 80s was a proposal about aesthetics as a reference for psychotherapy. And later on, I edited a whole book about this topic. So I feel very comfortable with your insistence on grounding aesthetics in the felt body, the senses, the pathic experience. However, I don't forget, and I don't want to forget, the complementary dimension of aesthetics. I'm okay the way you propose to differentiate aesthetic from art and beauty and so on, but I don't want to separate the aesthetics in the sense of the felt and the felt body from the formation of forms. And as Gestalt therapist, I consider we are deeply involved in this process of formation of forms. From an empathic experience, human beings have to create forms, Gestaltung. Thus, the second dimension of an aesthetic approach is about the Gestaltung, the process of shaping, of formation of forms. I agree that the issue of art and beauty which are often assimilated to aesthetic, are only declensions or illustrations of how the aesthetic concept could be used. But maybe we could use as a way to differentiate the two words proposed by Erwin Strauss, aesthesis, which is felt, and aesthetics. About atmosphere and affordance, my reading of Erwin Strauss or of Tellenbach opened me to the importance of atmosphere as a primary component of the situation. Atmosphere is, of course, one of the simplest sensual realities. Senses don't discriminate anything, presence of this or that, only changes experienced by the body, which opens to the affective sphere, often called stigmund. No figure is made. We are with a pre-sensory, pre-reflective, pre-verbal experience. And my reading of Gibson has driven me to suggest our community 20 years ago to pay a lot of attention and to assimilate and widen his concept of affordances that you mentioned, in order to stop thinking that the ego or the self could be the only master in its home. I agree with several of your proposals, which look like I call a delocalization of emotions, which are not understood in Gestalt therapy as an inner experience, but as a contact boundary experience. Delocalization of self, which is no more understood as a core, or kind of psyche, but as an emergent function from the contact with and in the world. And to remind too how our founders insisting on the fact that we are not in a field, but of a field, thus creators and created by our field. The quasi-things are almost things. Maybe it's a part of your proposal, which was for me the most difficult to understand and to accept. Up to now, maybe I will develop, but up to now I didn't see the interest of looking at an atmosphere as well as emotions or many other experiences as almost things or quasi-things. For me, the words resonates as reification, and one of the major contributions of our founders has been to stress temporality of every experience, rather to reify it. In its refusal to fix experience into a definitive form and to substitute one fixed gestalt for another, our entire theory becomes for me, an aesthetics of the ephemeral. I am aware that you didn't deny the ephemeral dimension of atmospheres and so on, but why to fix it? Why to transform it in quasi-things? I cannot catch it. In contrast to other approaches which show an interest in structures, Gestalt therapy always invites us to a provisional dynamics. In the words of the poet Henri Michaud, within my consciousness there are many vaguenesses and constant discontinuities. My aesthetics of the ephemeral could seem as a contradiction with my personal values and ethics, because for me the other is my foreground and my bond, my belonging, long-term bonds is the most important thing in my life. Aesthetics of duration or aesthetics of the ephemeral. On this background of duration, meeting the other every time as an ephemeral experience, as if we would never meet again. Thank you.
Hello. The first thing that I want to say is that as of the moment I started reading your articles and being in contact with this philosophy and aesthetics, I felt a great familiarity, probably due to the phenomenological epistemology and the aesthetic reference as a common ground. According to the seminal argument posed by Laura Pils, that Gestalt concepts are philosophic and aesthetic, my choice has been to explore Gestalt therapy theory from a phenomenological point of view, especially grounded in the work of Merleau-Ponty, as well as building a close dialogue with arts and aesthetic. Working with here and now experience is a foundational proposal in Gestalt therapy framework, rather than a technique or a method. It's an aesthetic principle, as it considers that the world is given through sensible experience, not through reflexive consciousness. It's an ethical position, as it affirms the singularity of each situation and the legitimacy of experiencing and creating within the situation from what emerges of the field, without external determinations, which has also a political dimension. This proposal is rooted in the phenomenological conception that we are being in the world, that our existence is temporality, which in Gestalt terms means that the first reality is contact, that everything must be primarily considered as beginning at the boundary. Meeting the difference, the novelty, the other, being affected and unbalanced, spontaneously moving from affection to creation, Spontaneity is the feeling of growing in the organism environment that is going on, not making or being made by it, but growing within it, not active nor passive, but middle in mode. Therefore, Gestalt therapy tears down an intrapsychic or subject-centered conception to consider the contact boundary a pre-reflexive and non-dualistic area as the origin. From the perspective of a pathic aesthetic, the main interest is in the atmospheric perceptions and in the analysis of situations in order, you say, to identify what is present and active on us. Entities which are not full objects but quasi-things. Quasi-things fully coincide with felt body in a pathic area, which is an intermediate area-less space, pre-dualistic, where goes on a pre-reflex communication with the world, if I understood. This pathic area seems to me very similar to our notion of contact boundary. Even though atmospherology focuses on a spatial perspective, as Jean-Marie said, and Gestalt therapy focuses on a temporal one, the idea of an arealess space is very interesting and can be conceived as a kind of temporalized space. As you have proposed, atmospheres are apparent and ephemeral, an idea that indicates both spatiality and temporality. The main point I would like to put across refers then to pathic and passivity. Emphasizing the ontological status of quasi-things, their authority, and the pathic experience is a strong affirmation of the influence atmosphere have as outside feelings, which is the title of your conference. It makes explicit the aim of desubjectivation implicit in your paradigm and reveals the nuance of passivity I came across in your proposal, in your speech. It's important to remark that this kind of passivity antecedes the distinction between passivity and activity, as I reckon. This is a conception of passivity that refers to passion, suffering, receptivity, foundational availability, having nothing to do with being determined by outside force. This is a kind of passivity that we also find in Gestalt therapy. Awareness is the process of spontaneous configuration that emerges from the organism-environment field. Sensing is the awareness dimension that, rather than a physical feeling, means being affected by something that presents itself. What to be achieved demands overture and acceptance. This type of openness is not an active or voluntary act. Rather, it is inherent to being engaged within the situation. Therefore, from our perspective, what is given and affects is not outside, but is given from the actual situation, from an articulation of the field. This articulation, as I reckon, is an intersubjective dimension that allows an intercorporeal experience to take place. The subject is not passive nor active, and the solution for overcoming this kind of dichotomic thinking is to stop conceiving different unities which meet and then relate to each other. Taking radically a field perspective means understanding that the subject, the other, and the world first emerge from a common ground to differentiate next as ego function, that we understand as a motor spontaneity capable of creating and expressing. Body is sedimentation and expression. Expression is middle mode, intertwine, personal style, and generality. Creation is discovering and inventing, as Pius Refalain Goodman stated. Inventing sense, it is action that suffers. When discussing the meaning of experience, you propose that there are senses sedimented outside us that can be verified through our felt bodies. I agree with this idea that there are senses sedimented in the world, in atmospheres, feelings, objects, landscapes, and I remark that they are also in our bodies as habits. It's from this impersonal or anonymous, Merleau-Ponty says, background, from this unreflected layer, a brute being, that we emerge, first of all, as sensibility and bodies, not as private conscience. The other doesn't appear at first to me as another subjectivity, but as another body and sensibility who is part of the same world I belong to. The other is my equal that moves to the world as I do. I feel cold and see the other moving closer to get to the fire to get warm. I feel sadness before a present occurrence and see the eyes of the other filled with tears. This underscores the idea of intercorporeality as a possibility to feel together, which can seem strange if perception and field are thought of as private inner states. The pathic and atmospherological aesthetics emphasize cooperative relationship between perception and the more nuanced dimensions of quasi-things, which emotionally tunes their surroundings. Quotes, like climate conditions, they modulate the lived and three-dimensional space whose presence we feel. End of quotes. What emotional tunes can be thought as clues that we feel together and that give us experiential and sensible certainty, which is pointed by Professor Griffero and also by Merleau-Ponty, who has proposed the idea of perceptive faith to reinforce that verity is not a property of cogito, of thinking, but relies on an irreflected and felt dimension. As I reckon, this corresponds to the id of the situation, from which I can feel together, connected to the other as felt bodies, co-affecting and being affected from what is given. Our starting point in a therapy session is pre-contact, id function, the therapist herself, bodily present, waiting with overture for whatever comes, affects, and impresses him. From this state of openness, we receive and invite the other to meet at the boundary. Instead of reflexive work, we intend to produce an atmosphere that allows a spontaneous dialogue between felt bodies in contact as an aesthetic experience. This is the most revolutionary aspect of Gestalt therapy, as I see it. When you propose a pathic aesthetics rather than agnostic or interpretative one, claiming an ability to welcome what happens to us, you are affirming the legitimacy of the sensible dimension as something that does not originate as an inner state. This represents a shift from a classical phenomenology to an ontology, which we don't have time to develop here. It's very opportunely to emphasize the pathic and to recognize the stunning property of atmosphere, calling our attention to a domain of indifferentiation and to different possibilities of communication from this pre-reflective and pre-subjective dimension. The notions of intercorporeality from Merleau-Ponty, interaffective sharing from Daniel Stern, for example, id of the situation from Gestalt therapy refers all to a kind of affect attunement given in an intercorporeal and pre-reflexive domain, and can help us to go further in our theoretical and practical explorations about therapy. Meeting contemporary situation reflects a movement towards efficacy, activity, autonomy, individualism, and velocity, resulting in disengagement from the world, rationality, and sensibility loss. How can we meet at the boundary in a desensitized world? I believe it's timely to call attention to pathicity, to reaffirm the pathic and the aesthetics in our work. We should withstand the speed of the contemporary world by practicing an ethics of slowness and of waiting, which is not subject to chronological time. As La Rosa, a Spanish philosopher, states, experience quotes, experience, the possibility that something happens to us or touches us requires a gesture of interruption, an almost impossible gesture in our time. End of quotes. In poetry and arts, we again come across a time of slowness. By going beyond pragmatic action and engaged as a body in creative praxis, we can regain meaning of life itself. Thank you.
Okay, there are many things. I will try to underline one aspect because I think that to underline or to focus the spatial dimension of our experience doesn't mean to forget the temporal dimension of the experience. Let's do a little experiment. We are talking about things and almost or quasi-things. And we have talked about felt body. So a very simple experiment is how we can differentiate our body as a thing and our body as an almost thing. Because a thing, this book is a thing, as defined surfaces, and it lasts during the time. If I don't find my book, it's meaningful to ask, where is my book? But if I am, and I will try to give an example, if I'm feeling a depressive field, this is not specific surface like these things. Is in the air, is in the space. And it doesn't last for all the day. If I'm not feeling a depressive mood anymore, I'm not asking, oh, I lost my depressive mood, where is it? Let's try let's just turn around in couples and just do this simple gesture. With your hand, come closer to the face of the other without touching the skin. And just feel, what do you feel? Without touching the skin. And just feel, what do you feel? Shh, without words. Okay. Okay, it's enough. Okay. Don't be so contactful, please. What I want to say is that you didn't touch the thing, the körper, the body as a thing of the other, because our body as a thing finished with our skin. But our felt body is around us, it's in the space. To think to that in terms of something that is in the space is not a thing, but is something that is there, helps me a lot to understand my clinical work. I give you just an example, and I will be very short. Let's stay with the example of the depressive field. When I'm off the depressive field, and I agree, Jean-Marie, with this underlying, when I'm off of the depressive field with my client, we sit in front of each other and something emerges. Something that is not a book, is not a thing. It's something that is real. Because if a third person comes in the room, feel that something is there in the air, and it's real. It's not a thing. I think that this can be seen as the emerging of the field in the between and around us that we perceive aesthetically by our senses. So I'm actualizing with my client a depressive field, and we are off of it. Of course, we are not just that. We are not just that, and this is an important passage. But first of all, something happens. And I'm not choosing what is happening. It happens to me. And it happens because there is an ecstasis. That means comes up. To ecstasy means that something come out. So there is an ecstasy of our bodies that fill in the space with something that is an atmosphere. What is very relevant in my understanding of the clinical work is that in this view, I'm not working anymore on the patient, on his or her inner states. I'm working by changing my way of being present and co-create that depressive field in a way that I look to change what is happening in the between of us. Maybe I can just do this. That already changes the field in the between. So this helps me not to focus the inner state of the patient, not to focus the patient as an individual, but to focus what is happening in the between that I'm co-creating. And because I'm co-creating, as Jan Rubal has written, we are depressing together, exactly because I'm co-creating what is happening in the between, this atmosphere that we are creating, because of that, I have therapeutic space to change the situation. Because I can't change only myself. This will change the field, and this hopefully will change the memories of me and the patient. So if we should measure the change in therapy, we should measure the change of the therapist before the change of the client, probably. So, in this view, the paradoxical theory of change is not paradoxical anymore, because to change the patient, you miss the point. Is not that the point? You have to change what you are co-creating, so you have to change yourself. And I think it's very important what Jean-Marie said, not to lose the time. Yes, because the atmosphere and alpha entities are changing every moment, moment by moment. If this wouldn't be possible, therapy wouldn't be possible. So, for me, this gives quite a support to understand, to think about what is happening in the air between us. Thank you.